Okay, well, thank you everyone for coming to this event on a particularly busy week. Today we have with us Professor Melissa Lane. Professor Lane is the class of 1943 professor of politics at Princeton. And I believe until this year you hold the role of the director of the University Center for Human Values.
I finished that role in July. Yeah, but
Right,
for 8
okay.
years I did that. Yeah.
Yeah. So this year, Professor Lane is also the Isaiah Berlin visiting professor at Oxford, in which capacity she is giving her lectures titled Lycurgus to Moses, Thinking with Lawgivers in Legal and Political Philosophy. So yes, let's give a welcome to Professor Lane. But for today, we will be discussing something slightly different. So back in Hillary of 2018, Professor Lane was also here giving the Carlyle lectures, which was titled Constitutions Before Constitutionalism, Classical Greek Ideas of Office and Rule. And these lectures have since become a monograph, which were published last year. And in this, she does a close reading of three of Plato's political dialogues, the Republic, the Statesman, and the Laws. And she argues that Plato was committed to a kind of constitutional project where political power is always to be limited by procedural rules. And this goes against some conventional readings, so, for example, by Karl Popper of Plato as an authoritarian. So we will be discussing some of the questions that have arisen in regard to this monograph since last year. And we'll also be discussing some connections between this work on Plato and your Berlin lectures this year. So I was wondering if we can start by describing the context that Plato is working in. So what were some of the existing strands of thought in Greek political philosophy that the three Platonic dialogues would be responding to?
Yeah. So first of all, let me say thank you, David, for putting this event together, inviting me, and preparing a list of very thoughtful questions. And thank you to everyone who's either here or watching online as well. I know it's a very busy week towards the end of term, so I appreciate your interest. So if we think about the context that Plato is working in the early to mid 4th century BCE, there's really multiple contexts. And one of the challenges with thinking about Plato is that he's so multivalent. He's responding at the same time or in different places to developments in sort of what we might think of as physics and metaphysics, to developments in epistemology, but also, a special interest to my work. He's, I think, writing against the backdrop of Greek poetry, particularly epic poetry and lyric poetry, which is performed in contexts within each polis and, in Panhelletic contexts, such as Panhellenic festivals. And I think he's also very much acting in the shadow of these great lawgivers. So in Athens, Draco, and especially Solon. And so, in many ways, people have often thought the Republic is Plato's attempt to rival Homer. Of course, he explicitly criticizes the works of the poets and wants to reform them in books 2 to 3 and exile the poets unless they can meet certain conditions from the ideal city in book 10 of the Republic. But at the same time, I think we often neglect the extent to which both of these works, and let's focus especially for a moment on the Republic and the Laws, although my special love is Plato's Statesman, and it's probably the least known dialogue to many people. So I also would be happy to talk about that, but the Republic and the Laws are more parallel. So when we think about, so let me sort of say how this is an answer to your question. So when we think about Plato's Republic and Laws, what are their titles in Greek? So Republic is politeia and Laws is nomoi. And a politeia, as Aristotle would come to define it, is defined by a combination of offices and laws. So a politeia is a constitution, and we can think of it as being composed of both offices and laws, but also in a broader sense, people at the time were already thinking about a politeia as more broadly a distinctive way of life. So what are the habits, customs, practices, and values that support the Constitution, the offices, and the laws? And so at the time that Plato is writing these works, he has this inherited backdrop of the Homeric epics, where there's an idea already there of what is a good king, usually sort of observed in the breach, but there's already a sort of long tradition of thinking about what would a king be. But by the time that he's writing, I argue that the regimes all around him are regimes, what we can call constitutional regimes of political office and law. So if you look at what is Athens in his day, what is Sparta in his day, but there's 1,000 poleis, what are virtually all of them in his day? They are constitutional regimes that are governed by office holders and laws. So for example, if you think about one of the very earliest Greek laws, which we find from the polis of Dreros on Crete in the 7th century, that law says how the people who hold the office, which is called cosmos in that city, how they should be regulated. And in particular, they shouldn't hold that office for more than 1 year. So the very earliest Greek laws are about how do we regulate the offices. And so if we think about that, you can think, well, so what is the point of these laws that are regulating offices and regulating political life? And they're attempting to, I argue, if we sort of think what's their implicit purpose, like what would we say they're trying to achieve? I argue that they're trying to achieve the good of the ruled. And we can see that especially in the case of the rules for accountability, which are also extremely widespread in all of these cities. Almost all of them, oligarchies and democracies, have auditors who are responsible annually to audit the city's accounts, and in Athens also to supervise the actions of all of the office holders. So what I want to say is what Plato is doing in his work, Constitution and Laws, is thinking about how should these offices be organized, what kinds of power should they have, and how can they actually be appropriately restrained in the way that the constitutional regimes of his age were trying to do. But arguably, all regimes have a kind of Achilles heel in trying to do that. So he's trying to plug the existing Achilles heels, but of course his own work will have Achilles heels as well, because it's inevitable that any attempt to kind of regulate political power can never be foolproof. So sorry, that was a very long answer, but I hope that's helpful.
No, that was great.
Yeah.
So you mentioned that already we can see in the existing political orders around Plato that there's kind of an implicit purpose.
Yeah.
And this purpose is the good of the ruled. Now, this seems like a pretty strong thing to say by modern standards, right? That like the ultimate purpose of the telos of all political activity is the good of the people being ruled. So I was wondering if this is something Plato just takes for granted, or does he actively argue for this view?
Yeah. So good. So I use these two terms to sort of talk about all of this. So telos, which is purpose, and then taxis, which means order in Greek. And so I use the word taxis to think about the organizational structure of a constitution. So a constitution will have a telos, and it tries to realize the telos through the taxis. And then the question is, what different kind of taxis will best protect and realize and safeguard the realization of the telos? So it's interesting, when you wrote me the list of questions, you said, well, it's a very strong thesis that Plato claims that the good with a capital G, right, the form of the good, is ultimately, in some sense, the regulative purpose of a constitution. And of course, if we put it like that, it sounds very strong. But what I want to say is, I think Plato's idea really grows out of a very everyday political conception that, again, I think we see it. If you think, what were these constitutions trying to do? If you have auditors who are holding office holders accountable for their actions in office. So this was a very concrete literal practice that at the end of every office holder's term of office, whether they were chosen by lot or by election, they had to give an account of their practice in office. And if they failed giving the account, it worked slightly differently in different cities, but roughly speaking, they could be put on trial, and then they could be punished very severely fined or exiled or even put to death if their malfeasance was so great. So if you say, well, what's the point of that, right? The point of that is to prevent people from exploiting their powers for their own benefit, usually, or for some purpose other than the purpose for which they're entrusted to them. So that's the sense in which I want to say it's not that I'm just saying it's an implicit purpose. If you actually think, well, what's the logic that explains the widespread practice of accountability mechanisms in ancient Greece, it has to be something like that. And so I think that therefore it is, in a sense, something that Plato inherits and takes for granted. But again, and of course, it's something that, they see already is often not followed. That's the whole point. You need these mechanisms because people might be abusing their power. So when we say the purpose of rule is the good of the ruled, it's not, therefore everyone is really doing it. But the point is that's what we should be aiming at. And we have to, again, come up with mechanisms to try to maintain that. So I call this kind of an evaluative nimbus that I think Plato inherits, in the sense that I think the Greeks in general are not Weberian about their politics. So this is more of a political science thought than maybe a philosophy thought. But, in political science, we have this idea our political concept should be evaluatively neutral. That's how we should think about political life. But I think the Greeks inherit this idea that, the point of political life should be to realize these values. Now, of course, it may fail. Individual people may not try to do that. In fact, they may be corrupt, but that's the point. And so I don't think that that's a kind of special weird thing that Plato thinks. I think that's part of the sort of general view of his age. And then what's really interesting about his thought is not this thought that it should aim at the good of the ruled, but rather, how are you going to do that? And that's where he's really coming up with quite radical ideas, different ideas in the different dialogues in order to do that.
So then how are the concrete proposals that Plato put forward for the taxes, actual procedural order, different from those seen around him at the time?
Yeah, so good. So if you think about it, right, any political order, if you have an order of office holders, and one thing that I argue, the book actually grew out of the recognition that in Greek, the very same vocabulary, so in particular, the noun archein and the noun arche and the verb archein, which are related, those very same words can be translated as rulers in a kind of generic sense, where it could mean absolute power, or we don't know exactly what powers they have. But those are also exactly the words that are used and translated as office holders, where it implies these kinds of limits on the power of office holders. So accountability is one of those limits. Term limits are very common in Greek cities, like I said about the dreros, cosmoi. So very often offices were for 1 year only. Most offices, you had to be chosen in a certain way. There are limits on your power. So all these things. So I think that what Plato is then doing in the structures of the cities that he imagines, especially again in the Republic and the laws, and I think the Statesman also fits into this picture, but it's more complicated, is to say, well, okay, then, how are we, so if you think about it, there's two questions if you have political offices. One question is, who is going to fill the offices? How are we going to choose those people? And then another question is, how do we control them when they're in office? How do we ensure that they are actually using their powers appropriately? And so I think Plato thinks really hard about both of those things. And what he says is, look, the problem with the way, the more familiar thought about Plato is that he's only interested in the question of who should rule. So this is what Popper famously says, right? But I think a lot of people think this. He says, Popper literally says, Plato is only interested in the question of who should rule, and then he thinks they should just be given absolute power. He's talking about the Republic. And what I want to say is, no, he is interested in the question of who should rule. And the way he thinks about that, though, is through a series of tests for who should be in office and how they perform in a series of offices, which is very much like what Greek cities again did. So, for example, in Athens, even if you were chosen to be in an office, you couldn't take it up unless you had passed another procedure, which was it's called dokimazia, where you have to prove that you're a citizen in good standing. and I love this example in the current American political climate, right, that you've paid your taxes, for example. Okay, that was a concrete thing that you fulfill all your basic civic duties regarding your parents and the gods, which of course are part of Greek civic duties. And so what I think is that if we think about that sort of testing to make sure you should be in an office, that's how we can think about what's going on in the Republic. The people at the top of the age hierarchy who themselves have passed all the previous, they've been passed by their superiors. They then do the testing on the people who are younger than them. And so it's a series of tests to see, do these people actually have what it takes? And in work that I've been doing since the book, I've been really trying to show these aren't just cognitive tests. They're actually tests of their experience, their performance, their sort of emotional and other kinds of virtues. So it's all of this. But even still, you might say, okay, but that's still testing who it should be. But also what's very striking, and again, this is absolutely on the surface of the Republic, is that he uses the language of law to say, we have to lay down as laws. It's completely explicit, that language at the end of book 3. We have to lay down as laws this series of restrictions on the people who hold those powers of being guardians, which I also argue he explicitly calls offices as well. And sorry, just going back to the vocabulary. So there are clues sometimes as to whether we should think about them as offices or as sort of untrammeled positions of rule. For example, when they're in the plural, that's a sign that something is meant as office, because if it's an untrammeled position of rule, usually there would only be one person. Whereas if it's multiple offices, then they have to kind of relate to each other. They have different powers. So you can't always tell from the Greek, but there are sort of clues that sometimes that's what he's thinking about explicitly. Anyway, so not to go on for too long, but so what are these laws? So what's interesting about these laws is, again, if you think about the accountability measures, right? They say we're going to entrust you with civic funds, and then we're going to scrutinize and hold you to account for how you use those funds. So what the laws are these are the laws that deprive the guardians of kin and of wealth, right? And so the way that I look at those laws is to say, Plato is trying to sort of one up the existing laws. We're not just going to allow you to have wealth and then scrutinize how you use the wealth. We're going to actually deprive you of wealth, because if you're deprived of wealth, then we would immediately see whether you had exploited civic wealth, because then suddenly you would have wealth that you weren't supposed to have. So it's a kind of perfect test in a way. So it's like, rather than let you exercise wealth and gain private wealth, and then we have to check whether you use civic wealth and arrogated it to the private, we're just going to deprive you of the possibility of that by law. So it's a kind of doubling down on that strategy. And actually, I think this is in the book. I don't even know if it is. It's in a lot of talks that I've given before. There's this wonderful, High Wycombe, which is just near here, near Oxford. So is this in the book? I can't remember.
Yeah, I remember.
Yeah. So in High Wycombe, there's this several hundred years old tradition that at the end of each year, the mayor and certain other office holders have to be weighed on scales. And the idea is, if they've gained weight, that might be a sign that they had used their civic powers to kind of literally enrich themselves and engorge themselves, right? And this still happens every year. At least it did up until the pandemic. I think it's still happening now. So that's the kind of idea, is that like there's this, it's again, and to go back to this sort of thing of, is this some weird idea of the good? This is a very basic idea of political probity, right? This basic idea, are you using the civic resources and your civic powers, for the good of others, or are you engorging yourself? And that's the basic thing that I think that all of the kind of very recondite rules in the Republic are actually getting at, and similarly in the laws. Yeah.
And it really does seem that if Plato puts forward these proposals positively, then, he can't be read as an authoritarian the way Harper is.
Well, that's what I think, and I think it's on the surface of the text. But, so the thing that people will say is, they'll say, well, but who's going to enforce those laws, right? Well, so they'll say two things. So these are the two big criticisms of my view. So one is, in the book, I describe this whole picture, I call it, and this is the thing every review and, discussion is focusing on, I call it a functional equivalent to accountability. So if you're a sort of invested democratic theorist, you will say, how is it an equivalent, a functional equivalent to accountability? Because what we mean by accountability, and certainly democratic accountability, is that people get to control the accountability. But in this story, let's just focus on the Republic again. Actually, in the laws, it is more clearly bottom-up accountability in a certain way. But in the Republic, and my story, right, it's the higher guardians holding the lower guardians accountable. So how is that accountability? We think accountability should be kind of bottom-up in some way. And so what I say to that is, well, that's just why I said functional equivalent, because this is where I think what Plato is doing is going back to that question, well, what was the purpose of those accountability mechanisms? The purpose of the accountability mechanisms in all the cities around him, including Athens, but not only Athens, was to keep the office holders oriented to the good of the rule, right? That's the telos. And so it's a functional equivalent because we're looking for a different way of doing that. Why? Because clearly in the existing auditor mechanisms, for example, and there are other mechanisms too, but just to focus on those clearly have Achilles' heel, right? So like in Athens, how were those auditors chosen? They were chosen by lottery, right? So they may not be wise. They might be corrupted. Now then, how were they held accountable? Well, they were held accountable by the next year's incoming auditors, but there's no special virtue or kind of special ability to scrutinize in any of that. So, okay, it's doing some of the work, but you can see how things might fall through the cracks. So I think what Plato is trying to say is, okay, there's flaws in that way of doing it. Let's do it this other way. Now, are there flaws in his way of doing it? Yes, absolutely. But my point is just to say, like, every means has flaws. So what I think he's trying to get us to see is, are there other ways we can think about? Not that those are the right ways, but that we can see that what we're trying to do is safeguard the telos through the taxis, and that's never going to be easy. So that's one objection is it really accountability in any meaningful way, or is it even an equivalent, or if it's only a functional equivalent, is that good enough, right? And I'm happy to kind of talk about that more. But the second objection is, I said, it's going to be laid down by law, these restrictions on family and wealth. And then people say, well, but who's going to enforce the law, right? If the guardians are going to enforce the law, then surely it's not really meaningful to say it's laid down by law. So this is actually partly where the Lawgivers project comes in, because one thing that's interesting in Plato's dialogues is that so if you think about the literary structure of the Republic, from a certain point in Book 2, Socrates, Glaucon, and Adeimantus actually, again, explicitly constitute themselves as lawgivers who are giving laws for a city in speech. And it's exactly the same word, the same language that's used in Plato's Laws at the transition between Books 3 and 4. So in both of these dialogues, you have this kind of meta level of lawgivers who are laying down the laws, and then within the city, you have the rulers who are also subject to the laws. Now, this is why I then went on to do the Lawgivers project, because I think this is a very characteristic way that people in Greek cities actually thought about law. I think they thought about law as something that was largely inherited from these Greek lawgivers of the past, that should not be changed wholesale. Maybe you can tweak it around the edges through democratic means. But I think it's wrong to think about Athenian democracy, for example, as fundamentally about we make the laws. That's what makes us Democrats. Rather, the democracy too thought we inherit the laws and then we do other things within the laws. We judge, we hold offices, we do that. So I think that, so again, like I want to say, I don't think Plato is just helping himself to this language of we're going to constrain the guardians by the law. That's actually a way that the Greeks thought about lawgivers and law. And so again, I think he's in line with kind of existing ways of thinking. But again, my final sort of response to the objection would be, well, there's no perfect answer to this in any legal system. I mean, if we look at what the United States has been going through, right, there's a real question. If the president defied the Supreme Court, or if somebody else defies the Supreme Court, there's this kind of famous, there's the famous sort of saying, how many battalions does the Pope have, right? How many battalions does the Supreme Court have, right? At some level, people either act according to their constitutional roles and according to the law, or they don't. And so I think that I don't think Plato's scheme in the Republic is on any worse footing, actually, ultimately. Or, I mean, it's, there's still differences of degree, but I think if we think about this as a problem kind of at the fundamental level for any political constitution, I think any political constitution is going to face that problem. What happens if the rulers ultimately defy the laws that are supposed to constrain them? So I don't think the Republic is unique in that.
I see. But your point earlier in your response to that first objection about the functional equivalence, you said Plato's not saying that this is the solution. He's not saying that this is the best system. He's trying to get us to think what are some better ways we can do this better than the existing ones. But this brings me to another question that I think other people have raised as well, which is it's just in general pretty difficult to pin down a view on Plato. And these three political dialogues have been read historically as, supporting views ranging as widely as totalitarianism on the one hand and just grassroots self-governance on the other hand. And so facing this ambiguity, thinkers like Cicero, for example, have just held that Plato's a skeptic and we can't really attribute any views to him, and he just sort of explores different views through his various characters. But you, I think, undoubtedly attribute views to Plato himself. What's your methodology for kind of distinguishing between views that Plato holds versus ones that he just explores?
No, this is a great question, and this is very challenging. And I mean, for those of you who've been studying Plato, you will know and be familiar with this problem. So let me say two things about it. So one is, I don't think there's a perfect fail-safe interpretative method. Just as there's not a perfect fail-safe sort of political, solution. I think, and so I'm actually personally very sort of ecumenical, in terms of the many ways people read Plato. I read many people reading Plato in different ways, and I learn from all of them. My very first undergraduate teacher of Plato was a Straussian at Harvard, Harvey Mansfield, and then I went to Cambridge to do a second BA year, part 2 in philosophy, and I was working with Miles Burnyatt, and he was a rabid anti-Straussian. And then when I started writing my PhD on the Statesman, really almost all the literature that was in English anyway at that time on the Statesman was written by Straussians. So I had to read that, and they were doing very good work. So, so I don't think anybody has a monopoly on how to read Plato. My own sort of method in this book is to say, first of all, I think that this point that I made about the vocabulary, I think that is really a point that any interpretation should grapple with. And I don't think people have adequately grappled with it. And one thing that's interesting about it is sometimes when I start explaining it, people kind of jump in and they say, oh, and all the translators have gotten it wrong. And actually what's really interesting is many translators have gotten it right. So there are actually, in many languages, in French, German, Spanish, Italian, English, and people have told me in Russian and Korean, right? There are these key passages in the heart of the Republic in books 6 and 7, books 5, 6, and 7, where he's clearly talking about Callipolis, where translators translate this noun or the participle of the verb for ruling or office holding. They translate it as office and office holding because they are sensitive to these Greek linguistic patterns that I mentioned, the plural and these other sorts of symbols. So when you look at these translations at the heart of the Republic, all these translators, not everyone, but many, 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 and in all of these languages, right, when you say political office, it comes with these ideas of limited powers, accountability, again, maybe realized in different ways, but nobody has written about it and said, why is he talking about offices in the heart of, in book 7 of the Callipolis, he's talking about offices? What? And so that was sort of my starting point, really, was that, and I think because it's so widely recognized by translators, I think any interpretation has to cope with it and address it, and very few have. So at least the virtue of mine is that it is actually addressing that point. And I'm sure people will come up with other ways of reading it, but I think you have to at least sort of, as Aristotle would say, save the phenomena, right? And on this point, nobody has been saving the phenomena, really. And then the second thing is, what I would say is that I think I am a bit of a coherentist, I guess, and I've become more of a coherentist about Plato than I was when I started. So when my first book on Plato that had been my PhD on the Statesman was more sort of developmentalist, like he has these views in the Republic and then he changes his mind on certain points in the Statesman. But what I actually have come to think is rather what we should do is think, how do we explain what he's doing in having written all of these different dialogues? And of course, more than just the Republic, Statesman, and Laws, but there are certain ways in which those dialogues are comparable. And so my argument is to say in all of these, he's exploring this basic question of the relationship between rule and office. We find this vocabulary in all three of the dialogues, deployed in different ways. So he's thinking about that, which comes to him from his surrounding context. And then we find explicitly again these questions of what's the telos of politics, what different structures. So then I want to say, well, so what's interesting is that we see him working this out differently in the different dialogues, and that's what we should be trying to understand. So I do attribute views to him about what I think is going on in each dialogue, but kind of ultimately, does he think we should have the Republic or we should have the Laws? I think it's more interesting to ask, how are the Republic and the Laws differently exploring the same sort of political problematic in some way?
Yeah. For the problematic itself, kind of it's defined in some key terms that are, characteristic of Plato, you would say.
Yes, I mean, I have the smoking gun of the vocabulary on rule and office. Another way to think about it, so Lloyd Gerson has made this point, which I find helpful, which is, how can you attribute views to Plato where there are certain views that you can be pretty sure you could never attribute to Plato, like the opposite of, for example, political power should exploit the ruled. If you read Plato, it's just clear that it just doesn't make any sense to think that you could attribute the view to him. So then you can say, okay, so then the opposite of that view. Now, it's all interpretation. I don't think there's any magic bullet that gets you outside the sort of problematic of hermeneutics. And everyone faces this, whatever their method, everyone has that same problem. But I ultimately, I think all I would want to say is I think I have the smoking gun. People have to address it. They haven't. And then secondly, I just want to say I think my method is fruitful. I think ultimately you test these coherentist methods by how much can they account for and how kind of fruitful are they in helping to make sense of, again, the very complex, multi-layered dimensions of these dialogues. But I would never say I can prove that my reading is the only correct reading. I don't think I can do that.
Right, that's a helpful way.
Yeah.
I want to move on to a totally different question that also came up regarding the same work. So, as you've argued, there's a key condition to this whole constitutional project, and it's a compossibility or simultaneous possibility between civic freedom on the one hand and political rule on the other hand. And this political rule then will need to be realized through the willing obedience of the people being ruled. Yeah. But I'm worried that this freedom that is compossible with rule is always the freedom of some against the unfreedom of others outside the polis. And in Plato, this comes up in two ways. First, the role of the ruler / guardian / king has been like a militaristic role since Homer. And this militaristic language goes into Plato too, especially in those passages where he's praising the virtue of willing obedience. Mm. So this kind of obedience is thought of as something like the obedience of a soldier to a commander in the face of some enemies outside the polis. Mm. And then the second way this comes up is Plato uses the language of slavery to talk about political rule. And we know, in fact, that the civic freedom of Athenian citizens are often thought of as against the backdrop of slavery. So maybe to the modern ear, this kind of freedom or willing obedience sounds more like a complicity, animated by a promise of this limited edition freedom. So I was wondering if the positing of someone outside the polis is unavoidable for a constitutional project like the one you're describing, and if so, does that say anything about the extent to which we can take it as a guide for us today?
Yeah, thank you. This is a really important question, and it's a very hard question. So let me first say one of the things I argue in the book, as you know, it was in the longer written version of your question, was that so when Plato uses the language of slavery, so for example in Republic 9, when he says there's different contexts in which he does it, but for example he says, for someone who isn't able to rule themselves, it's better that they should be ruled, kind of like a slave. And he says, this is my ultimate answer. Socrates says, I should say, going back to our previous question, this is my ultimate answer to Thrasymachus. And he actually brings up Thrasymachus's name. It's 590 around C to D in Republic 9. It's a very important moment. And what I argue in the book is that what Plato is doing with slavery is that he's interested in this question of he's interested in the relationship of giving orders, and he's interested in what he's in the relationship of giving orders, that kind of hierarchical relationship. So he uses slavery to think about, as it were, the taxis. But but there's this other very interesting moment in Republic 9 where he, I think, makes clear, although it's in passing, that he knows that the telos of actually existing Greek slavery at the time is the exploitation of the rule of the slaves rather than their good. So he's not doing an Aristotle move of saying, oh, it's natural slavery, which of course Aristotle didn't say was true of all Greek slavery, but even that it could possibly be true of any. And what is that moment? It's this moment where Socrates imagines a slaveholder who's exiled out of a polis, kind of finds themselves on a desert island with their household that includes their slaves, and would then expect to suffer a rebellion from the slaves against them. And so I find that kind of very interesting, because I think Plato is there acknowledging, what would slaves do? They would rebel against their masters if they had the chance. There's not a pretense there that there's something else going on. So he isn't. So I don't think that that's the dimension of slavery that he is kind of. He's not saying, oh, it's for the good of the actual slaves that they're ruled. It's when he takes over that metaphor, what he's taking over is the hierarchy rather than the actual telos, which he knows is exploitative. So then the question is, so given all of this, how can any of this be kind of interest to us as political philosophers or political theorists? It is true, and I think it is a very interesting point so there's different ways people can be outside the polis, right? So one is enemies outside the polis, like another polis outside the polis. And clearly the Greek world, that's how they thought about politics. What it was to do politics was to be in one polis, and then there's all these other poleis around you, as well as other kinds of states. And that you could possibly be subject to war and invasion and destruction, and in fact being sold into slavery, which of course they saw as the worst possible fate or death. And so I think they certainly at this moment let's say generically, at this moment, there's not a cosmopolitan vision, right? It's a vision of one polis against another polis. And that is very explicit in the Republic, as you say, like in, book 2, the whole reason we initially get guardians is that the polis is, once it becomes luxurious, is going to have defensive war, and it seems like also offensive war. So that's definitely true. In terms of whether it has to be exploitative internally, I guess here I kind of want to say I think the jury is out. I think it's up to us as political philosophers to, think about, is there something in this vision that can be made compatible with a world of political equality that doesn't include that sort of internal exclusion? I teach the history of political thought, so most of what I teach are texts from periods in which there were various groups of people who were excluded at the time, maybe not slaves, but although for many of these societies that we study, the thought of slaves, but even if not slaves, women for a long time, foreigners from different places, other kinds of people. So, in that sense, I sort of feel like, well, we would have to throw out the whole history of Western political thought if we felt like we couldn't reconstruct the geometry of these ideas, at least in principle. Now, again, it might be that it doesn't work in a given case. I'm sort of open to that, but I don't think that the fact that it was exclusive at that time means it can't have anything to say to us today, sort of by definition.
So it's the idea like there's something that formally looks like what Plato had in mind. You would still call a constitutional project that we could potentially reconstruct now.
Yeah, and again, because I mean, this is just a familiar thought, and I know to some people, and maybe rightly, it can be very unsatisfying. Like, you say, well, look at the American founding, right? You have, constitutionalism, you have freedom and equality, but you have slaves and the subordination of women and, later Asian exclusion and, all kinds of other restrictions on citizenship. But you have this idea, over time we can, expand it and da, da, da. Now, is that the right way of thinking about it? Are there ways in which those projects, and this is your question maybe, are there ways in which those projects, remain seamed by those original exclusions? Yes, definitely they do. So I think you're right. But, nevertheless, have groups of people, in fact, been at least formally included who were formally excluded? Yes. Is that inclusion, fully sort of substantively equal and meaningful? No, in many cases, so, it's easy to invoke Frederick Douglass, talking about the Constitution, but he wanted to insist, although he's critical of the Declaration of Independence at one point, he wants to insist that the Constitution was in fact originally not wedded to slaveholding, despite the 3/5 clause, and could be used and be meaningful for the project of emancipation. Now, not everyone agreed, so anyway, it's cheap I'm not entitled to read Plato through Frederick Douglass. But it's a similar kind of move where you say, okay, there are these exclusions, but does the logic, allow for an expansion? And what I've tried to say about the logic of constitutionalism for Plato, I think, arguably allows for an expansion.
Right. So it's not essentially tied to these experiments. Yeah,
that's what I would want to say. But I think this is a hard question, and I'm glad that you raised it. Yeah.
I do want to leave some time to talk about the connection between the Carlyle lectures and the Berlin lectures. So in the Berlin lectures so far, you've presented a really compelling figure of the lawgiver in ancient Greece. And historically, we know that in Athens, after the expulsion of the 30 tyrants in 403 BCE, legislative power was given to this kind of council. I don't know if council is the right word.
They're sort of they're more like juries actually.
Juries,
it's not a fixed group of people. They call them into being for a given episode or purpose. Yeah.
Right. Mm-hmm. So you have these juries of lawgivers, and Plato is definitely aware of this mode of operation because he picks up on it in the laws.
Yeah.
But this problem we said earlier about, who will sort of enforce the, this question we mentioned earlier about, who will guard the guardians, who will kind of prevent these people that are vested with this ultimate power to against kind of misuse of that power. That question is surely just as much of a problem for lawgivers as it is for political rulers.
Yeah, okay, so there's a lot in this question, and some of this is what I'm going to talk about in my last Berlin lecture, but which will eventually be online, so if you're interested, probably a few days after I give it next week. But and there's a lot in this question. I guess, let me say two things. So before I answer the specifics of your question, which are complicated historically a little bit, let me just reiterate that I think one of the points of the lectures, the Berlin lectures, is to make this point about the givenness of law, that I think that in modern democratic theory, we tend to think that the paradigm of democratic powers is making the laws, right? And it's very interesting because in many ways that's inherited from Rousseau, and yet Rousseau also, as I argued this week, was deeply kind of fascinated by and in the grip of these lawgiver figures, these ancient Greek and also biblical and Quranic and other lawgiver figures. So it's complicated, but I guess that would be one sort of takeaway, is that I think, can we reconfigure idea of what democratic powers are where lawmaking isn't central? So and maybe that's the link to what I want to say about Athens. So I want to say, so Athens in this period in Plato's lifetime, in the fourth, most of his lifetime in the 4th century. So as you say, so there's two things about it. One is the Athenians talked about Solon as their lawgivers, and they sort of brought lots of the laws under the ambit of Solon, even if really they had been made after Solon. So Solon was back in the early 6th century. And we know that there are laws that were passed later, but the Athenians would say the laws of Solon, and they kind of meant of that. So that in itself is an interesting fact, that like they have this double consciousness. They think we're democratic citizens, but they also say we have the laws of Solon. Those are our laws. So that's one of the things that I think is really interesting. How do we make sense of that? And then just to finish, the very specific thing that you're talking about is, so in 403, they pull all the laws together in writing, which they hadn't previously had them all compiled together in writing. And then they say, these are the laws, only the laws that are here collected all in writing. But if anyone wants to change them, they can propose a change to the laws, and then we'll convene one of these bodies, these nomothetai, jury-like bodies. And then the person who wants to change the laws will make a speech. Somebody will make a speech against changing the laws, and then the nomothetai will vote on whether the laws should be changed or not. So what's sort of interesting about it is it's now out of the hands of the assembly, right? The assembly isn't making the laws anymore. Basically, the laws are fixed. It's just these juries that are going to entertain these occasional proposals. And although, as you say, it's very interesting that they're called nomothetai now in the plural, they don't frame the new laws, right? So Solon framed the old laws. He had the content of the laws, ex hypothesi, whereas these people don't do that. So again, they're kind of displacing and like playing down the project of making laws. And so this sort of interesting question, like, what is democratic life if it isn't about making laws? And there's a sort of whole other question that we could talk about there, but maybe we should see if anyone else has any questions as well before I know we have to end. But
No, we still have half an hour.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. I thought it was only an hour. Okay.
Oh, no, it was scheduled for 6:30 to 8.
Oh, I misunderstood that. Oh, okay, great. All right, okay.
Is that okay?
That's okay. Yeah, that's fine. We don't, but there's also not so many people here, so we don't necessarily have to go all the way till 8. We can.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, maybe this is a good point to open up for questions from the audience. Maybe while people prepare their questions, I can also ask you a little bit more about Solon in particular, because as you mentioned, Solon is very unique in that he's the one figure in Athens on whom both the roles of lawgiver and of political ruler converge.
Yeah.
Does Plato ever say anything about, does he ever use Solon as a figure to discuss kind of analogies or disanalogies between the roles of lawgiver and political office?
Yeah, so he talks about Solon occasionally, and I think he's not such a huge, I think he's very interested in the role that Solon played. I don't know that he was a huge admirer of Solon himself. There's this one moment in the symposium when he says Lycurgus in Sparta was the savior of the Spartans and the savior of all of Greece, but Solon, this is Diotima talking to Socrates, who's an Athenian, and she says, Solon, you Athenians, sort of revere as your lawgiver. And I think there's something telling there. Lycurgus was the savior of Greece, but Solon, you Athenians revere. I mean, it's a little bit of a detail, but I think, one thing I suggested at the end of one of the lectures was that for those of you who are reading the Crito, Plato's Crito, where you may remember that there's the personified laws of Athens who speak. And it occurred to me to wonder, why didn't he there have Solon be a character and have Solon be the person who was defending the laws of Athens, like in an imagination? Because he does that with Protagoras, for example, in the Theaetetus, right? It would be a very natural thing if you say, who do the laws of Athens speak through? They speak through Solon, like Solon's, that. So, but why? So why doesn't he do that? I mean, who know? We can't ever answer that question fully. But one reason might be that I suggested is that he is interested in this. What he wants is an idealized Solon, right? He wants the Solon who truly understands the good of the ruled and kind of best understands how to realize it. And that's not the actual Solon. The actual Solon did his best, maybe, but he wasn't a Platonic philosopher, so by Plato's lights, the actual Solon wasn't good enough, even though the function that he played is a function that we need. And so I mean, I'm curious for any of you in the audience who are, have studied the Crito or the Republic, or probably not the Laws or the Statesman, but if you have, how does any of what I've said kind of resonate with what you've read or not?
I guess when you talked about multiple offices being part of Plato's vision, it seems to me to have a bit of tension with his idea of philosopher king, which seems to be more of like one ruler. Do you think there's a tension there? Yeah,
good. No, that's a great question. So if you think about how the philosopher rulers come to be the philosopher kings and queens, of course, as he says explicitly, they start off as auxiliaries, where they're fighting, and they're also the people who are procreating in this controlled way. And then they have to be tested and there's a very clear educational program set out in Book 7 where, between the ages of 20 and 30, they do this, between 30 and 35, they do that, between 35 and 50. And so I'm particularly interested in this moment between 35 and 50, and this is one of those passages that I said all the translators say offices. And now I can't remember the passage number, but it's in Book 7, and it's when they go back down into the cave, right? So it's between the ages of 35 and 50, they will go back down into the cave, and it literally says that. So it's playing on the cave, metaphor so it's after that. And it says in the cave, they will engage in military. Now I'm trying to remember exactly how the Greek goes. It's something like they will do military things and the other offices pertaining to young people. So here, if you're 35 to 50, you're young, right? So, and that's one of those plural offices thing that everyone translates as office. So what I say is actually the people who are holding the offices are the people between the ages of 35 and 50. So you can think of them as the sort of apprentice rulers. They've got beyond the auxiliary stage. And they're actually the people doing, in effect, the administration, like what we would think of as the everyday tasks of ruling. They're actually running the military, overseeing the education, whatever else needs to be done. That's what the passage says. And then once they get beyond that, the ones who again perform well at that age, then at the age of 50, they will be brought to see the good. And then they will become the full-fledged philosopher kings and queens, right, over the age of 50. So then the question is, so what are those people doing, right? And so the way I interpret that is I actually put a huge amount of weight on this language of kingship. And I say, let's think of what they're doing as reigning in the kingly sense of R-E-I-G-N, as opposed to office holding. And so they are the ones who are overseeing and kind of safeguarding the younger people. And their main role is actually to select their juniors and make sure that they are adequately performing, both in choosing the right people and then testing them after their performances. So actually, when you think of what are the philosopher kings actually doing, he never says what they're actually doing is exercising all the political powers in this unqualified way. Actually, the people who are in the cave doing the office holding and those are the 35 to 50-year-olds. The people who are up here are and this is what I call so this is the safeguarding relationship, and this is the who will guard the guardians question, right? So if we have the people who are 35 to 50, they're the guardians, literally they are guardians, but who's going to guard them? So we need somebody who's doing a different function. And that's what I think that function is. And then I think it's also, you said they're single, but of course, one of the things that's interesting about them, as you know, by putting them in the plural, right? But I want to emphasize, they are plural, right? It's not just one person. They are plural. And so again, now he doesn't do as much with this as I wish he had, but I think there is a kind of implicit idea, because what do they do? This is the other place accountability comes in. I didn't say this earlier. So the language of accountability. So those practical auditors, in Greek, the phrase for that was logon didonai. The people who were having the offices had to give an account, literally. So logos here can literally mean like account, either in words or a financial account. It can also mean. So to give an account, that's what the office holders had to do to the auditors. That's the phrase. That is exactly the phrase at the highest point of the dialectic in Republic 7, is the philosophers have to learn how to logon didonai. They have to learn how to give and take an account, here meaning of the forms, right, kind of reasoning. But I think it's very telling that, again, like what makes them able to kind of, oversee the whole Constitution, it's this ability to give an account. So they do have certain kinds of powers, but he actually never says what they do is just go around giving people commands. What he says is what they do is they select the people under them. And again, the reason I think that's important is that nobody gets to be self-certifying in the Republic. I think that's also important. It's not like, oh, we're the philosophers, so we're just going to set up and rule. You have to be chosen by the people above you. Now, of course, then you have the problem of how do you get the whole thing started in the first place, and that is a problem. But the sort of logic of it isn't like, yay, we're the best people, so we're just going to start ruling. It's never that. But I don't know how satisfying that is to you.
Hello. I'm not classically trained in any way, so forgive me if this is an obvious question, but I'm just wondering about how the law is actually structured. So you mentioned there's like a sort of like the law given by the lawgivers, and that's eventually codified, and that's sort of like your basic law. So I'm thinking, is that a sense of sort of concrete things or principles, or is there or does it concern itself more with daily life? So like obviously, there's pretty obvious stuff like don't murder each other, but is there stuff like, how is practical things like sanitation or agriculture legislated? Is that through the core constitutional law, or is that by a separate mechanism?
Yeah, no, good. It's a very good question. So in the case of Solon's laws, and those are the ones we know the most about, but I think, we can and can't generalize them because they're the ones that we know the most about. In some ways we do, but then in other ways they're distinctive. But no, so in the case of Solon's laws, one of the things that's interesting about them, and this is true of Lycurgus's laws too, is that they cover very concrete situations. So they run the gamut. And this is why I said the meaning of politeia, it actually has these two meanings. It can mean sort of constitutional structure, offices and the laws that govern the offices, but it can also mean the way of life and the kind of concrete ways of living together. So for example, Solon's laws include laws about funerals, laws about inheritance, laws about contracts, laws about homicide. They mostly inherited the homicide laws from Draco, but laws about agriculture, all these things. So they're very concrete, the laws, but then some of them are also constitutional laws, like laws about what are the powers of the, different offices, what should the Areopagus Council do? Who should be on the juries, who should be eligible to hold the offices. Those are also all part of the laws. So one of the things that's interesting is that there's a sense in which, our way of thinking about basic laws is to say, oh, constitutional laws and then sort of ordinary laws. And it's not quite right for them. There is this sense of, but, they inherited this totality of laws kind of, and all of those would be part of the laws. And they are very concrete. And this is true, Lycurgus also It has laws about collective meals and what money should be used. So Lycurgus says they shouldn't use gold and silver currency. They should only use iron currency because that way they won't start coveting gold and silver, those sorts of things. So there's, so it's very concrete, actually. I mean, it's a range from the more abstract to the more structural, let's say. They're not abstract. I guess the point is they're not just abstract principles. They're actually laws in our sense of laws, but they cover the range from these sort of more organizational laws to, sort of civil law, criminal law, administrative law, and they don't have those distinctions, but they kind of cover that range.
That makes sense, thanks.
Yeah.
Then it seems incredible that these really specific laws would be then viewed as something that's pretty much fixed, inherited, and not a subject of democratic discussion.
Yeah, I mean, this is, again, what I think is just so interesting. I think they have this double consciousness. Like, they know that they do change some of these laws. So, for example, Pericles and Ephialtes in the mid-5th century changed citizenship laws, and they know that they do that, and that is done through democratic means in the assembly. So it's a sort of double talk, a little bit. But what's interesting to me is what's at stake for them in doing the double talk. Why don't they just embrace the idea, these are our laws, we're a democracy, we can change them. Why are they invested in the figure of the lawgiver, and what work is that doing for them, kind of theoretically? So, of course, so they definitely, the legal landscape does change in a number of specific ways. But there's also a slightly weird thing that sometimes practice changes without changing the laws. So, for example, I have my own views on this, but Solon had set up these 4 property classes, and all the citizens were in different property classes. And he set up that only the upper 3 property classes could hold the offices, whereas the poorest people who were citizens, so excluding slaves still, those people could serve on the juries, and interestingly, and they could themselves serve as like auditors. They could hold the office holders to account, but they couldn't hold the offices themselves, right? So there's a kind of elitism built into Solon's picture. And then there's a kind of argument among scholars as to, it doesn't seem that they ever repealed that provision, but there's some evidence that seems to suggest that by the 4th century, they weren't following that anymore. So they just, in practice, started allowing people who were in the highest 3 classes to also hold the offices. I myself am not so sure this is true, or at least true not just as an exception, but it's kind of an interesting example where, they may have just changed their practice, but they didn't formally repeal the laws or modify them. Anybody else reading Plato or have read Plato interested in talking about?
Thank you for your talk. I'm personally interested in Aristotle's ethics and
Yeah.
not a Platonist, but I always find this. I think the fundamental claim you're making, Plato is making, is that there is for the good of the people,
Yeah.
of the ruled. And as I'm also interested in Aristotle, this is a very familiar claim for me.
Absolutely.
But at the same time, every time I hear or somebody else talking about this, I cannot just think about either Berlin's objection about the negative and positive conception of freedom. And what Berlin, when it says that if you have really one conception of freedom, it might be just wrong. So that's why my understanding is that's why Berlin opted toward a more negative conception of freedom, which is more like laissez-faire, just do what you want to do. Yeah. And then, so I think this talk today, your focus was more on the taxes side of how to bring about the telos.
Yeah.
But also this telos part is really important to any politician. Politeia.
Yeah.
And I was wondering, is there any room for the rule to kind of question the fundamental telos itself?
Yeah, thank you. It's a great question, and it's wonderful that you bring a Berlin objection, since I am here as the Isaiah Berlin professor, which is a great honor. And I started my lectures by quoting Berlin. Yeah, this is a complex question. So on the final part of it, let me come back to the freedom part. But the final part of what you asked was, is there any room in Plato's thinking for the rule to kind of question the conception itself? And this is where the kind of form of the dialogues and their content sometimes seems to be in some tension. So the form of the dialogue seems to be, encouraging people to have dialogue and to ask questions, and the kind of Socratic model and all of that. And yet, and some people have put this as, could Socrates have survived in the city of the Republic, right? If he were in the city of the Republic, would he just have to agree with everything that was being said rather than being able to kind of challenge and be a gadfly? Yeah, I think it's true that the ideal cities and the second best city of the Republic and the laws don't place huge value on sort of people questioning the fundamental values of the city. I think they do take very seriously that citizens have to actually believe and sort of hold those values. So I sort of sometimes say, I think Plato's cities are kind of success conceptions. Like, if the people don't in fact hold the values, then the whole thing has failed. And then the rulers just are exploiting or dominating, So now then a lot hinges on, did they form the beliefs rationally? Did they have adequate, and I think it's true that Plato is a little fragile on some of those grounds, potentially. On the other hand, if we go back to your earlier question, to the earlier part of your question, which is about positive and negative freedom. So one of the things I've argued in the book is that I don't think Plato's idea of sort of good self-rule, I don't think he does think that's a conception of freedom. He doesn't call that a conception of freedom. I think actually his conception of freedom is the pretty standard one that already the Greeks of his day held, which was, on the one hand, political freedom that you have through constitutional sort of Lockean political freedom, like you're free within what the laws allow you to do. And then also they already had, again, this is not a new Platonic idea, that there's a sense in which if you're totally dominated by your appetites, you're unfree. But I don't think that has to be like a weird new Berlin positive conception. Like, if you read Greek poetry, they already thought that, So again, I'm not sure that it's fair of Berlin to enroll Plato on the positive liberty side. I don't think he's doing what he's doing primarily under the sign of positive liberty. But it is true that he thinks that it's better for people to have their souls organized in a certain way. It's better for the city to share certain values. Like, those things are true. So, there's a way in which, yes, he would still be subject to Berlin's critique, I think.
And I was also thinking about this transparency of what kind of fundamental value given Politeia has, and how whether it should be transparent to the ruled as well.
Yeah.
But I think you touched upon that part of it.
Yeah.
As well in your
Yeah, I mean, again, there's this little passage in, I always forget if it's book 6 or book 7 that I talk about it in the book, where Socrates says, it's sort of, I think it's book 6 maybe in the Republic, at the end of, they've been having this whole discussion about what's presented as this shocking thesis that the philosophers should rule, and only the city will be well ruled if the philosophers rule. And there's this whole discussion about, well, why wouldn't you think that? Well, because you think philosophers are these either crazy people, or you think that they're useless people. And, so there's a sort of whole answer to that. And then it gets to this point where Socrates then says to Glaucon and Adeimantus, so do you think if we said these things to people, would they then be willing to accept it? And either Glaucon or Adamanta says, yes, maybe they would be willing. And I think that's a kind of interesting moment because it suggests that it's not enough that we gave this argument. We have to think that the people in the city would accept it. That's what it hinges on. And that's my kind of success conception idea, right? And what's interesting about that is that is actually the conclusion of a line of actual argument. That isn't saying, oh, and that rested on the noble lie or something. It's actually rather, the arguments that they've been giving for who would the philosophers be, how would they be educated, all of that. That's what's going to actually maybe make people willing to accept it. Now, again, that might be totally wrong. People might not, in fact, be willing to accept it. And actually in the Statesman, just since I love the Statesman so much, there's this really interesting passage towards the end where it's kind of diagnosing why aren't people willing to accept the idea that if there were an ideal statesman, and he uses this language of people just can't stomach it, right? It's this very graphic verb. Like people can't stomach the idea of an ideal statesman. It kind of makes them queasy or something, And so again, the thought is also, how do you, help people get over that hump? But you have to get them over the hump, right? It doesn't work unless they get over the hump. So, yeah.
Is there any evidence that Plato's real-life role as advisor to the tyrant of Syracuse is correlated to his ideas in the Republic?
Yeah, okay, good. So this is in particularly the 7th letter, but there's a number of letters that have come down in the Platonic corpus, I think 13, if I'm not mistaken at all. And first of all, there's a debate about whether or not the letters are authentic. So there's 2 different questions here. One is, did he actually do this thing? And then the second thing is, do the text that we have about it, represent his view? I'm pretty skeptical about the second thing. So I think the alternative is that these were Hellenistic compositions written after Plato's death in a time period when writing letters and people's names became a kind of literary genre. I'm pretty skeptical that they could have been Platonic, partly because he worked so hard to conceal his identity or not to speak in his own voice in the dialogues, which of course then goes back to David's question about, well, then how can we attribute views to him? But leaving that aside, it seems to me very odd that then he would have written these letters saying, here I am speaking in my own voice, hello, So, however, that sort of view of the text maybe has led me to discount the historical, facts insofar as we think that they probably are true, which is that he does go to Syracuse several times, and he advises both, or he tries to advise both one tyrant and then his son. And it goes very bad. And really, especially in the second case of the son, he's working with one of the tyrant's advisors, and he's trying to kind of really, that's the person that he's friends with. And then there's some stories that say even, that he was shipwrecked and sold into slavery himself. And there's all these interesting things. Usually people actually read it more as influencing the Statesman rather than the Republic, arguably. But but this idea that he's interested in what could you say to an actual ruler or an actual city? Are there ways you could try to bring about reform, and sort of what would be the conditions of that? I think that is a helpful perspective for thinking about him. It's not one I developed as much, but it's true that like a number of his students in the academy, and even he himself for other cities also, are asked to go and be lawgivers for those cities. And actually it's in the form of being lawgivers rather than rulers. So clearly there is something significant here, but it's not a perspective that I've really reflected on as much as I maybe should have done given the facts. But again, partly because I'm kind of skeptical about the text, and so it's a little hard to know what to think about it.
Okay, no last questions? Then let's give another round of applause to Professor Lane.
Thank you for the great question.